Hafa my name is Ilaria K. Williams-Duenas, and this is my final research project for BA 401 Government Accounting. In this presentation, I will be discussing the operating surplus and deficit ratio, looking into the Government of Guam's general fund for the fiscal years 2018 to 2022. First, I'll be going into the definition of the operating surplus and deficit ratio and how this portrays a government. Next, I'll be going into the benchmark and some warning trends of this ratio. Next, I'll be going into a chart which graphs the operating surplus and deficit ratio for the Government of Guam in the fiscal years 2018 to 2022 and analyze some of the changes that I saw. Lastly, I'll be going over some recommendations that the government can use to improve this ratio. So what is the operating surplus and deficit ratio? This ratio is a way to evaluate the government's operating position and helps to indicate if the government had sufficient revenues to cover current costs or expenditures. It's also a way to show citizens if the government effectively balanced its budget in the current year and if the government is able to manage its finances sustainably and responsibly for its citizens. It's also just a way for the government to show public trust, transparency, and accountability in their reporting objectives. The formula for this ratio is the excess or deficiency of revenues over or under expenditures divided by the total general fund operating revenues. A positive ratio indicates a surplus, which means that revenues exceeded expenditures in the current year, and a negative ratio indicates a deficit, meaning that the government did spend beyond its means in that current year. We'll be discussing this a little further in our analysis portion on the chart slide. Next, I'll be going into the benchmark and some warning trends for the operating surplus and deficit ratio. A benchmark is a standard or a point of reference against which data can be compared or assessed. The benchmark for the operating surplus or deficit ratio is 0%. Because the government does aim for a positive ratio or a surplus and tries to refrain as much as possible from a deficit or a negative ratio, 0% is the standard. But of course, anything above 0% is also acceptable because the higher the ratio, the more strong a government is in their financial performance. Next are the warning trends, which are also just red flags to look out for when conducting this formula. The first is abnormally large deficits, which are 5% or more, and the second is 2 or more years of consecutive deficits, which mean that the government has a history of spending beyond its means. So this chart displays the operating surplus and deficit ratio for the Government of Guam's general fund in the fiscal years 2018 to 2022 in thousands. The yellow columns in this chart display the deficiency of revenues over and under expenditures. The red line in this chart displays the operating surplus and deficit ratio, and these numbers were concluded from the formula provided in previous slides. As you can see here, we also have the benchmark trend indicated by the blue line at 0%. By looking at this chart, you can see that the ratio does exceed the benchmark in all 5 years and does report increasing surpluses from 2018 to 2022. It is important to note that in prior years before 2018, the Government of Guam did have a history of borrowed and not balanced budgeting. So this is important to look out for because we do not want to continue that trend where the government is borrowing from other funds and reporting surpluses because of that, because that can create more long-term problems for short-term fixes and solutions. The most significant change in this chart is, of course, the gradual increase of reported surpluses. Specifically in 2019, the ratio did increase mainly due to increased total revenues from taxes, intergovernmental, and interest and investment earnings. And at the same time, expenditures also decreased due to the protection of life and property and individual and collective rights. So although the Government of Guam does seem to be in healthy financial standing at the moment, due to the gradual increase of reported surpluses within the past 5 years, here are some recommendations for the Government of Guam to improve efficiency and effectiveness in the operating surplus and deficit ratios for future years. The first recommendation is to create a reserve fund. So the Government of Guam can place these surpluses in a reserve fund for emergencies and shortfalls in the future or for other governmental funds. By reviewing their unassigned fund balance, it does show a negative, which means that the government is not fully utilizing these surpluses to help other departments of the government and fully utilize their resources. The second recommendation is to prioritize spending. This can be done by suggesting citizens be more involved in the budget process. Their feedback can help policymakers identify the priority areas when creating an annual budget for the government. The third recommendation is to monitor agencies' spending. By monitoring agencies' spendings, we can determine which agencies are spending or are not spending their appropriations and how this is affecting overall operations. For example, by looking at the Public Education Department of the government, they receive the largest appropriation, yet they are in the most disarray. This year, many public schools have been shut down due to health code violations and have had to start sharing resources with open schools. The government of Guam's public education sector needs to be more properly monitored and need to start using their appropriations more wisely so that the resources can be better utilized. Thank you, everyone. This concludes my presentation for today on the operating surplus and deficit ratio. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns regarding my presentation. My contact number and my email is listed down below. Thank you.